They saw the gray sweater, the worn sneakers, and the economy tote bag, and in that instant, the crew decided she didn't belong in first class. What they didn't realize was that the quiet woman standing in the aisle was about to change several careers before this plane ever left the ground. The tension began 37 minutes before departure, beneath the cold white lights of Gate C-12 at JFK Airport. Evelyn Carter stepped onto the aircraft with calm, measured movements, her soft brown hair tucked behind her ears, and a paperback novel pressed lightly against her chest. At 39, she carried herself with the kind of quiet grace most people overlooked precisely because it never demanded attention. The flight attendant greeting passengers barely looked at her before forcing a tight professional smile. "First class is to your left, ma'am," she said automatically, clearly assuming Evelyn belonged somewhere farther back. Evelyn nodded politely. "Thank you." A businessman in a tailored charcoal suit glanced up from his phone as she reached seat 2A. His eyebrows tightened immediately. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds, but Evelyn noticed it. People always thought subtle judgment was invisible. It never was. She placed her small carry-on into the overhead compartment and settled quietly into the cream leather seat beside the window while soft piano music drifted through the cabin speakers. Outside, rain streaked slowly across the glass of the terminal windows. The businessman beside her stared again, longer this time. "Excuse me," he finally said, lowering his voice. "I think this section might be reserved." Evelyn looked at him calmly. "Yes, I know." His jaw shifted awkwardly, as if her composure somehow irritated him more than embarrassment would have. Before he could answer, the lead flight attendant appeared. Sophie Blake. Tall, immaculate navy uniform, blonde hair pulled into a flawless twist. The kind of polished confidence that came from years of deciding who deserved comfort and who didn't. Her smile froze the instant she saw Evelyn seated in 2A. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "could I see your boarding pass?" The businessman immediately leaned back, suddenly interested again. Across the aisle, another passenger removed an earbud to listen. Evelyn handed over her phone without protest. Sophie scanned the screen once. Then again, something unreadable flickered behind her eyes before her expression hardened. "There seems to be an issue," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Evelyn felt the shift instantly. Cabin energy changed fast when someone was being singled out. Conversation slowed. Eyes lifted. The businessman beside her folded his arms with visible satisfaction. "Issue?" Evelyn asked softly. Sophie kept holding the boarding pass instead of returning it. "This seat assignment doesn't appear consistent with your boarding group." A woman across the aisle smirked faintly. Someone farther back whispered, "Knew it." Evelyn remained still. "I booked the ticket 3 weeks ago." Sophie's professional smile thinned. First-class seats on this route are typically reserved for priority clients and executive members. The implication landed exactly how she intended. The businessman gave a quiet chuckle. "Probably one of those app glitches," he muttered. A few passengers smiled under their breath. Evelyn could feel the eyes now, measuring her sweater, her shoes, her silence. Sophie lowered her voice just enough to sound dangerous instead of rude. "If someone allowed you onto the wrong cabin accidentally, we can escort you to the correct section before departure." Escort. Not guide. Not help. Escort. The humiliation arrived in layers, each one polite enough to deny, but sharp enough to wound. Evelyn slowly looked up at Sophie, her expression unreadable. "I'm in the correct seat." The cabin went quieter. Sophie's smile disappeared completely. "Then you won't mind if we verify your credentials before takeoff." The word credentials hung in the air like a stain. A teenage girl seated 2 rows behind quietly lifted her phone, pretending to text while recording everything. Evelyn noticed. Sophie didn't. And somewhere far above the Atlantic, long before the aircraft ever left the runway, the first crack had already formed in a system built entirely on appearances. Sophie Blake had spent 12 years mastering the art of making wealthy passengers feel important, and in her mind, the woman sitting quietly in seat 2A threatened the delicate social order of the entire cabin. She handed the phone back slowly, but not before allowing several uncomfortable seconds to stretch through the silence. "Interesting," she said, her tone cool and measured. "Your ticket does show first-class access." The businessman beside Evelyn let out a faint breath of disappointment, But Sophie was not finished. However, she continued, straightening her jacket, there are additional verification protocols for premium passengers on executive routes. Evelyn knew immediately that was not true. She had flown enough to recognize manufactured authority when she heard it. Still, she kept her voice calm. I understand. That answer somehow irritated Sophie more than resistance would have. Most people either became angry or embarrassed. Evelyn did neither. She simply sat there beneath the warm cabin lights, hands folded neatly in her lap, composed in a way that made everyone else seem louder. Sophie leaned slightly closer. Can you provide a secondary identification card? The businessman beside Evelyn smirked openly now. This is getting awkward, he muttered just loud enough for nearby rows to hear. A woman across the aisle exchanged glances with her husband. Another passenger quietly shook his head as though Evelyn had created the inconvenience herself simply by existing in the wrong outfit. The pressure in the cabin thickened. Flight attendants farther back had begun whispering discreetly while pretending to organize overhead bins. Evelyn opened her tote bag slowly and reached for her wallet. Sophie watched every movement carefully, her expression sharpened by suspicion disguised as professionalism. When Evelyn handed over her driver's license, Sophie studied it for an unusually long time. Evelyn Carter, she read aloud. Then her eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the name tugged at her memory, but the gray sweater, the modest handbag, and the absence of visible luxury drowned the instinct before it could fully surface. And what exactly brings you onto this route today, Mrs. Carter? The question crossed a line. Even the businessman beside Evelyn glanced sideways at Sophie after hearing it. It was no longer verification. It was interrogation. Evelyn met her eyes evenly. I am traveling to San Francisco. Sophie gave a thin smile. Obviously, a few passengers laughed softly. The humiliation was becoming communal now, almost entertainment for people waiting to depart. Behind them, the teenage girl kept recording quietly from her seat, her eyes growing wider with every exchange. Evelyn could feel the shifting atmosphere around her, the subtle relief people experienced when someone else became the target. It always happened the same way. One person decided who belonged. Everyone else followed to protect their own place in the hierarchy. Sophie finally handed back the identification, but her posture remained rigid. There is still the matter of your account profile. My account profile? Evelyn repeated softly. Sophie tapped her tablet screen. Our executive passengers are typically associated with verified corporate travel records, premium client history, or concierge membership status. There was at last. Not subtle anymore. The businessman beside her leaned back comfortably, convinced the outcome was inevitable. Maybe she used points, someone whispered behind them. Another voice answered quietly. Or somebody else's ticket. Sophie lowered her voice again, but every word landed clearly in the silent cabin. Mrs. Carter, if there has been some misunderstanding regarding access privileges, this can still be resolved discreetly before security becomes involved. Security. The word changed the temperature of the entire cabin. Several passengers immediately looked away from Evelyn as though guilt might somehow spread by proximity. But Evelyn did not flinch. She simply looked out the rain-streaked window for a brief moment, then back at Sophie with the same steady expression. And somewhere near the cockpit door, a junior crew member had just frozen after noticing a small gold emblem attached to Evelyn's boarding profile that should never have appeared on an ordinary passenger account. The young crew member, standing near the galley, felt his stomach tighten as he stared at the gold emblem glowing faintly on the tablet screen. He had worked for the airline long enough to recognize it instantly, even though he had only seen it once during training. Discreet executive protection status. Highest internal clearance. Reserved for individuals personally connected to the founding office. His eyes flicked toward Evelyn Carter sitting quietly beneath the cabin lights, while Sophie Blake continued treating her like a problem that needed removing. Sophie, he whispered cautiously as he stepped closer. Maybe we should double-check with operations before escalating this. Sophie barely looked at him. I already am operations on this aircraft. Her tone carried the sharp edge of public correction, and the young man immediately stepped back, embarrassed. Several nearby passengers noticed the exchange. One man in the second row shook his head with amused disbelief. This is unbelievable, he muttered. People will try anything for first class these days. Evelyn heard every word. She always did. But years earlier, she had learned something important about humiliation. The people humiliating you often revealed more about themselves than they ever revealed about you. Sophie crossed her arms lightly. Mrs. Carter, I need you to step into the jet bridge area while we resolve this issue. Evelyn looked up slowly. You want me to leave the aircraft? Sophie forced another smile, but the politeness had become visibly strained now. Temporarily. The businessman beside Evelyn exhaled with satisfaction and immediately reclaimed the armrest space between them as though the seat were already becoming available again. A woman across the aisle whispered, I knew something was off. Another passenger quietly laughed. The social tide had fully turned. Evelyn stood carefully, smoothing the sleeve of her gray sweater. Not defensive, not angry. Somehow that composure only made the cabin more uncomfortable. Sophie reached toward the overhead compartment. I can retrieve your bag. I can manage, Evelyn replied gently. For the first time, Sophie's expression flickered with irritation instead of confidence. Control was slipping in subtle ways she could not explain. The teenage girl recording from behind lowered her phone briefly and looked toward her mother. Mom, she whispered uneasily, they are kind of being mean. Her mother immediately hushed her without taking her eyes off Evelyn. Nobody wanted to become the next target by defending her. Near the cockpit, the young crew member had quietly opened the passenger profile again. His face drained of color completely this time. Beneath the executive emblem sat a restricted notation he had not noticed before. Founder family access. Direct authorization clearance. Internal advisory. Do not obstruct travel under any circumstance. His breathing became shallow. Oh no, he whispered under his breath. Back in the aisle, Sophie was still speaking in the polished corporate tone people used when trying to humiliate someone while remaining technically professional. Unfortunately, security protocols exist for a reason. Premium cabins require verification to protect the experience of our valued clients. Evelyn glanced slowly around the cabin. Expensive watches, designer handbags, carefully neutral faces pretending not to enjoy the spectacle. Then her eyes settled briefly on the airline logo stitched into the headrest beside her seat. A logo she herself had once helped sketch on a kitchen table nearly 16 years earlier beside a man who believed air travel should make people feel respected, not ranked. The memory passed quietly across her face before disappearing again. Sophie noticed none of it. Mrs. Carter, she said more firmly now, I am asking one final time. The cabin had gone nearly silent except for the low hum of conditioned air moving through the vents overhead. Then suddenly the intercom near the cockpit crackled alive. Lead attendant Blake, the captain's voice said carefully, report to the flight deck immediately. And for the first time since boarding began, Sophie Blake looked uncertain. Sophie Blake forced herself to maintain composure as she walked toward the cockpit, but the steady click of her heels against the narrow cabin floor had lost its earlier confidence. Passengers followed her movement with open curiosity now. The businessman in seat 2B leaned into the aisle slightly, eager for the conclusion he assumed was coming. Across the cabin, whispers moved like quiet waves beneath the low hum of the aircraft engines. Evelyn Carter remained standing beside her seat, one hand resting lightly on the overhead compartment, calm in a way that no longer felt ordinary. The teenage girl continued recording discreetly, her phone partially hidden behind a sweatshirt sleeve. Something about the entire situation no longer felt entertaining. It felt dangerous. Sophie disappeared behind the cockpit door, and the silence that followed stretched strangely long. 30 seconds, then 45, then a full minute. The passengers began exchanging glances. What is taking so long? Someone muttered. The businessman beside Evelyn smirked faintly, probably confirming the fraud alert. But near the galley, the young crew member looked physically pale now. He kept staring toward the cockpit door as though hoping Sophie would emerge before something irreversible happened. Inside the flight deck, Captain Raymond Ellis stood rigid beside his seat, headset hanging loose around his neck. His tablet screen displayed Evelyn Carter's passenger file in bright red executive coding usually reserved for government dignitaries or founding shareholders. Sophie entered with visible annoyance still lingering on her face. You called. The captain turned slowly toward her. What exactly have you done out there? Sophie blinked once, caught off guard by his tone. I am resolving a verification issue. Captain Ellis stepped closer, lowering his voice sharply. That passenger is under direct founder protection clearance. Sophie frowned immediately. That cannot be right. It is right. He rotated the tablet toward her. Sophie's eyes scanned the screen, then scanned it again. Her face slowly lost color. Founder family access. Internal advisory, level 1. Mandatory escalation prohibited. She swallowed hard. There has to be some mistake. The mistake, Captain Ellis replied coldly, was publicly humiliating a protected passenger in front of 43 people. The words landed like ice. Sophie stared at the tablet while her mind raced backward through every comment she had made, every accusation, every passenger she had allowed to join the humiliation. Who is she? She whispered finally. The captain looked at her for a long moment before answering. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Sophie still looked confused. Then Captain Ellis added quietly, Nathan Carter's wife. The room seemed to drop beneath her feet. Nathan Carter, founder and executive chairman of Airline, the man whose leadership speeches were framed inside every corporate training center in the company. Sophie's breathing became shallow. No, she whispered instinctively. She does not look. She stopped herself too late. Captain Ellis's eyes hardened instantly. Does not look like what? Sophie had no answer. Out in the cabin, the atmosphere had begun shifting in subtler ways. Delays this long usually meant something serious. Flight attendants stopped making eye contact with passengers. The young crew member near the galley avoided looking at Evelyn entirely now, as though ashamed by association. Evelyn herself remained composed beside seat 2A, her expression unreadable beneath the soft overhead lighting. Outside, the rain had intensified, streaking silver across the airport windows while distant runway lights blurred into long glowing lines. Then suddenly the cockpit door opened again. Sophie stepped back into the aisle, but the woman who emerged no longer carried the polished authority she had worn minutes earlier. Her face had gone tight, controlled, fragile, and every passenger noticed immediately. The businessman beside Evelyn sat up straighter as Sophie stopped directly in front of her. For one suspended second, the entire cabin held its breath. Then Sophie spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carter, may I speak with you privately? The silence inside the cabin felt completely different now. A few minutes earlier, it had been the silence of judgment, the quiet satisfaction people felt while watching someone else being embarrassed. Now it was uncertainty, unease. The businessman beside Evelyn slowly lowered his phone into his lap, no longer smiling quite as confidently as before. Sophie Blake stood frozen in the aisle, her carefully perfected professionalism cracking beneath the pressure building around her. Mrs. Carter, she repeated softly, perhaps we could discuss this away from the other passengers. Evelyn looked at her calmly for several seconds before answering. You seemed comfortable discussing it publicly before. The words were gentle, not angry. Somehow that made them hit harder. Several passengers immediately looked down at their laps. Sophie swallowed visibly. I apologize if there has been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. The cabin could feel the shift in language now. Moments earlier, Sophie had spoken with certainty. Now every sentence sounded cautious, fragile, rehearsed. Evelyn slowly sat back down in seat 2, instead of following her into the aisle. I would prefer to remain here. Sophie's face tightened slightly. Of course. The businessman beside Evelyn suddenly adjusted his tie and attempted an awkward smile. Well, he muttered quietly. These systems get complicated sometimes. Evelyn did not respond. The man cleared his throat and turned toward the window, wanting distance from the very humiliation he had happily participated in minutes earlier. Across the aisle, the woman who had laughed earlier now stared intensely at an in-flight magazine, without turning a single page. Shame moved quickly once status changed direction. Near the galley, 2 junior flight attendants whispered nervously while glancing toward Sophie. One of them quietly asked, Is that really her? The other nodded once. I saw the clearance code. The first attendant's eyes widened immediately. Oh my God. Sophie heard them. Her shoulders stiffened further. Captain Ellis stepped out from the cockpit moments later, his expression grave but controlled. Unlike Sophie, he understood exactly how dangerous the situation had become. Not because Evelyn was wealthy, not because of corporate consequences, but because the founder of the airline had built the company's public identity around one principle above all others: dignity for every passenger. And now 43 people had just watched that principle collapse in real time. Captain Ellis approached Evelyn directly. "Mrs. Carter," he said respectfully, "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you experienced on board this aircraft today." The cabin went completely still again. Hearing the captain confirm her identity aloud changed everything permanently. A passenger near the front slowly whispered, "Carter, as in Nathan Carter?" Another answered under their breath, "The founder?" The realization spread row by row like electricity. Sophie stood motionless beside the aisle, her face pale beneath the cabin lights. Evelyn looked at the captain steadily. "Thank you, Captain." Her voice remained calm, but exhaustion now lingered quietly beneath it. Captain Ellis hesitated before continuing carefully. "Mr. Carter has already been notified." Those words changed the atmosphere more than anything else had. Several passengers visibly straightened in their seats. One man immediately lowered his phone after realizing he had been recording earlier. The teenage girl behind Evelyn slowly stopped filming too, though not out of fear. Her expression had shifted into something closer to sympathy. Sophie's breathing became shallow again. Nathan Carter was not simply a billionaire executive hidden behind corporate walls. He was known inside the company for arriving unexpectedly at airports, speaking directly to baggage workers, remembering flight attendants by name, and firing senior managers over ethical violations without warning. Sophie knew exactly what kind of storm was now approaching. Then suddenly a notification sound echoed from the captain's tablet. He looked down at the screen. His expression changed instantly. And when he slowly raised his eyes towards Sophie Blake, the entire cabin understood something even worse had just happened. Captain Ellis stared at the message on his tablet for several seconds before locking the screen without a word. But the damage was already visible on his face. Sophie Blake noticed it immediately. So did everyone else in the cabin. The businessman beside Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman in the second row quietly removed her designer sunglasses, suddenly paying very close attention. Even the low murmur of the ventilation system seemed louder now against the growing silence. Sophie finally spoke, though her voice no longer sounded steady. "Captain." Ellis looked directly at her. "Mr. Carter is here." For one suspended moment, nobody moved. The words landed softly, but their effect rolled through the aircraft like distant thunder. Sophie blinked once as if her brain had failed to process the sentence correctly. "Here," she whispered. Captain Ellis gave a slow nod. At the gate. The color drained completely from her face. Outside the aircraft windows, several passengers near the terminal suddenly turned their attention toward the jet bridge entrance. Movement had begun gathering there. Ground supervisors, airport operations staff, 2 senior corporate representatives wearing dark navy overcoats. People did not assemble that quickly unless something serious had happened. Inside the cabin, passengers who had eagerly watched Evelyn's humiliation minutes earlier now avoided even glancing in her direction. The emotional gravity had completely reversed. Evelyn herself remained seated quietly beside the window, hands folded gently in her lap, her expression calm but distant. She looked less like someone waiting for revenge and more like someone deeply tired of disappointment. Sophie stepped closer carefully. "Mrs. Carter," she said softly, "I truly did not realize," Evelyn looked up at her evenly, "that I mattered?" Sophie froze. The words were not loud, not cruel, but they cut through the cabin harder than shouting ever could. No one spoke. A man near the front slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor. The teenage girl behind Evelyn stared silently at Sophie, no longer recording now, simply watching. Sophie opened her mouth, but no answer came. Because the truth sat there exposed beneath the cabin lights for everyone to see. If Evelyn had looked richer, louder, more polished, none of this would have happened. Captain Ellis's radio suddenly crackled at his side. "Founder boarding in 30 seconds. The entire crew stiffened immediately. One flight attendant near the galley nearly dropped a tray while trying to straighten her posture. Sophie instinctively smoothed her uniform jacket with trembling hands. Then the aircraft door opened. Nathan Carter stepped inside with calm, controlled movements that somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could. Tall, dark navy coat still damp from the rain outside. Silver at his temples. Sharp blue eyes scanning the cabin in one measured sweep. The founder of Airline did not look angry at first glance. That made him far more intimidating. Behind him stood 2 regional executives and the airport director himself, all visibly tense. Nathan's eyes moved past the crew immediately and settled on Evelyn. The hardness in his face softened instantly. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Evelyn gave a small nod. "I am fine." Nathan studied her for another second, noticing the exhaustion she was trying to hide. Then his gaze shifted slowly towards Sophie Blake. The cabin temperature seemed to drop the moment their eyes met. Sophie attempted a professional smile, but it collapsed almost immediately. "Mr. Carter," she began nervously, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding regarding boarding verification procedures." Nathan said nothing at first. He simply looked around the cabin, at the lowered eyes, the uncomfortable silence, the passengers pretending not to stare. The atmosphere told him everything before a single explanation could. Then his eyes returned to Sophie, cold and painfully calm. "A misunderstanding," he repeated softly. And somehow those two words sounded more dangerous than anger. Nathan Carter stepped farther into the cabin, and the entire atmosphere shifted around him. Not because he raised his voice, not because he demanded attention, but because every employee on board suddenly understood that the man standing in the aisle had built the company they depended on with a philosophy they had just publicly violated. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his dark coat as he stopped beside Evelyn's seat. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said quietly. Sophie immediately stepped forward, desperate to regain control of the narrative before it collapsed completely. "Mr. Carter, there was confusion regarding boarding classification and verification procedure. We believed." Nathan lifted one hand slightly without even looking at her. Sophie stopped speaking instantly. He kept his eyes on Evelyn. "What happened?" Evelyn remained silent for a moment. Not because she was afraid, because she was deciding how much truth the room deserved. Finally, she looked at him calmly. "They assumed I did not belong here." The cabin went still again. Nathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Based on what?" Evelyn glanced around slowly at the first-class cabin. The polished leather seats, the tailored suits, the expensive jewelry. Then she looked down briefly at her own sweater. That was answer enough. A regional executive standing behind Nathan quietly closed his eyes for half a second as if bracing for impact. Sophie's face flushed deep red beneath the overhead lights. "Sir," she said carefully, "I never intended disrespect." Nathan finally turned toward her. The look in his eyes made her visibly shrink. "You accused my wife of fraud in front of paying passengers. I was following protocol." "No," Nathan replied softly. "You were following assumptions." The words landed harder than any public outburst could have. Several passengers immediately looked away. The businessman beside Evelyn suddenly became deeply interested in adjusting his watch strap. Across the aisle, the woman who had laughed earlier sat perfectly motionless, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Nathan looked around the cabin slowly. "Do you know why Airline exists?" Nobody answered. "Because 16 years ago my wife sat with me at a kitchen table while I was 1 month from bankruptcy and said something I never forgot." He looked at Evelyn briefly, and for the first time warmth returned to his expression. She said, "People remember how you make them feel long after they forget the flight itself." The silence became almost painful. Sophie's breathing turned shallow again. Nathan continued calmly. "Every training manual in this company begins with that sentence." One of the junior attendants near the galley looked physically ill now, because they all remembered reading it. They just had not realized the woman who wrote those words was standing in front of them tonight. Nathan turned fully toward the cabin. "My wife refuses private terminals. She refuses celebrity treatment. She flies alone because she believes the only way to understand service is to experience it honestly." Several passengers slowly lowered their eyes in shame. The teenage girl behind Evelyn looked stunned. Sophie whispered softly, "I did not know." Nathan's expression hardened immediately. "That is exactly the problem." Sophie blinked rapidly, trying not to lose composure completely. "Sir, please believe me. If I had recognized her, if she had looked wealthier," Nathan interrupted quietly. "You mean?" The room went dead silent. No one could deny it anymore. Not even Sophie. Nathan took a slow breath and looked around the cabin one final time. Every person on this aircraft just witnessed how easily dignity disappears when appearance becomes currency. Then his eyes shifted toward the teenage girl, still holding her phone loosely in her lap. "And based on that camera," he added softly, "I suspect the rest of the world may witness it too." No one inside the aircraft moved after Nathan Carter finished speaking. The silence had become too heavy now, thick with embarrassment, realization, and fear. Outside, the rain continued sliding across the terminal windows, while blue taxiway lights reflected softly against the wet runway. Inside first class, however, every passenger seemed suddenly aware of how ugly the last 20 minutes had looked from the outside. Sophie Blake stood motionless in the aisle, her perfectly rehearsed confidence gone completely. The regional executives behind Nathan exchanged tense glances while Captain Ellis quietly removed his hat, almost like a gesture of respect toward a moment that had stopped feeling corporate and started feeling painfully human. Then a soft notification sound broke the silence. Everyone's eyes shifted toward the teenage girl in the row behind Evelyn. Her face went pale as she looked down at her phone screen. Her mother leaned closer. "What is it?" The girl swallowed hard. The video uploaded automatically. A visible ripple moved through the cabin. Sophie's eyes widened instantly. "Uploaded where?" The girl hesitated. Nervously. "Social media?" One of the executives immediately pulled out his own phone. Within seconds, his expression tightened. "It is already spreading." Nathan closed his eyes briefly, not out of anger, but disappointment. He had spent years building a company culture centered around dignity, humility, and respect. And now one viral video threatened to expose how quickly those values disappeared when appearance entered the equation. Several passengers immediately reached for their own phones. The businessman beside Evelyn stared at his screen, and the color slowly drained from his face as he recognized himself in the background footage laughing during the confrontation. Across the aisle, the woman who had mocked Evelyn earlier quietly turned her phone face down on her lap, unable to watch. Sophie's breathing became uneven. "Mr. Carter," she whispered desperately, "please. I can explain." Nathan looked at her calmly. "I already understand exactly what happened. That hurt more than shouting would have." Sophie's eyes filled slightly as the reality finally settled over her. Not only had she humiliated the founder's wife, she had done it publicly, arrogantly, and in direct contradiction to the company values displayed in every training seminar she had ever attended. Evelyn watched her quietly for several moments. Then, to everyone's surprise, she stood slowly from seat 2A. The cabin instinctively straightened as she stepped into the aisle. Nathan moved slightly toward her, protective by instinct, but Evelyn gently touched his arm. A silent reassurance. She turned toward Sophie. "Do you know what the worst part was?" Sophie looked up slowly, visibly shaken. It was not the accusations. Evelyn's voice remained soft and controlled. "It was watching an entire cabin decide I deserved humiliation before they knew anything about me." Several passengers immediately lowered their eyes again. The words reached everyone this time. Not just the crew. Not just Sophie. Everyone. Evelyn looked around the cabin carefully. People joined in because they thought it was socially safe to do so. The businessman beside her looked physically ashamed now. The teenage girl stared at Evelyn with quiet admiration. Nathan said nothing. He knew his wife well enough to understand that when she spoke softly like this, the lesson cut deepest. Sophie finally broke. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I judged you." Evelyn held her gaze steadily. "No," she replied gently. "You judged what you thought I could not do for you." The room went completely silent again. Even Nathan looked at her for a brief second with quiet pride. Because that sentence revealed the truth more clearly than any corporate investigation ever could. Near the cockpit, one of the executives received another notification and looked visibly alarmed. "Sir," he murmured carefully toward Nathan, "the video has already crossed 3 million views." And suddenly everyone on board realized this flight was no longer just a private embarrassment. It had become a public reckoning. The cabin remained silent long after the executive announced the number of views climbing across social media. 3 million people. Then 4. Then more. The video had already escaped the aircraft and entered the world beyond it, where strangers were replaying the same uncomfortable truth unfolding beneath the soft first-class lighting. Nathan Carter stood quietly beside Evelyn while the crew struggled to process what could no longer be contained or explained away. Sophie Blake looked smaller somehow now, as if the weight of what she had done had finally become impossible to carry with posture alone. One of the regional executives stepped forward carefully. "Mr. Carter," he began in a cautious corporate tone, "we can issue a statement immediately and suspend involved personnel pending review." Nathan did not answer right away. His attention remained on Evelyn. Because unlike the executives surrounding him, he understood this was never only about policy. It was about the feeling she had carried while an entire cabin silently agreed she was less important than everyone else around her. Evelyn looked out the rain-speckled window for several quiet seconds before finally speaking. No suspensions tonight. The executives exchanged startled glances. Sophie herself looked up in disbelief. Nathan studied his wife carefully. Are you sure? Evelyn nodded slowly. Firing people does not fix the reason this happened. Her voice remained soft, but every person on board listened now with complete attention. If someone only treats others with dignity when power is watching, then they never understood dignity in the first place. No one moved. The words settled heavily through the cabin. Captain Ellis lowered his eyes briefly. Even the businessman beside Evelyn looked deeply ashamed now, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Sophie's composure finally cracked. A tear slipped down her face before she quickly wiped it away. Mrs. Carter, she whispered, I really am sorry. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Not cold, not triumphant, just tired. I believe you are sorry now, she answered gently. But someday you should ask yourself why you were comfortable before. Sophie could not answer, because deep down, she already knew. Nathan finally spoke again, his calm voice carrying through the cabin. Effective immediately, every executive employee in this company will complete live passenger experience evaluations anonymously. One executive blinked in surprise. Nathan continued without raising his voice. No titles, no priority identification, no protected status. I want every leader in this airline to experience exactly how strangers are treated when no one believes they matter. The room went completely still again. It was not revenge. That was what made it powerful. It was accountability. Quiet. Human. Real. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, and distant runway lights shimmered softly against the wet tarmac. One by one, passengers slowly returned to their seats in silence. Nobody seemed eager to speak anymore. The teenage girl behind Evelyn quietly deleted a draft caption she had started earlier, replacing it with something simpler before posting the video again. Sometimes people forget kindness until they watch someone lose it. A few minutes later, the aircraft doors finally closed. The cabin lights dimmed softly for departure while the engines hummed awake beneath the floor. Nathan remained beside Evelyn for a moment longer before brushing a strand of hair gently behind her ear. You should not have had to go through this, he said quietly. Evelyn gave a faint, distant smile. A lot of people go through it every day. Neither of them spoke after that. As the plane slowly pushed back from the gate, the first-class cabin sat unusually quiet, filled with people staring out separate windows, each carrying their own private discomfort home into the night. And somewhere beyond the rain and runway lights, millions of strangers were watching the same story unfold, wondering whether they had ever once mistaken appearance for worth without even realizing it.